Okay, thank you all, and welcome back. We have our first power panel is indeed power-packed. I think you'd all agree. And we are very keen to talk to you today about how innovation in business and innovation in communications work together hand in hand. So you've already had the panelists introduced to you, so I will just dive straight into the questions. And I want to start with this idea. We heard a lot today, and indeed during Mr. Vishal Wanchu's presentation, about how communicators and communications can support the business agenda of innovation. And we will get to that, I'm sure, during this discussion. But I wanted to start perhaps by turning that around a little bit and asking you all whether you feel that communications can, in fact, lead innovation. And if so, how? And I wonder perhaps if I can start with you, Ishtiaq, because I know this is something that you had raised when we talked earlier about this session.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me at the back? This is the peril of having a call before you actually sit here for the panel discussion. And I think about a week back we had this call and we were discussing this. And when Arun asked me this question, should communication follow the business innovation, I said, why can't it lead it? And the question then falls in your lap as first question of the panel. So anyway, the reason why I said so, and I sort of stuck my neck in that conversation, is what is innovation? Whether we do it in communication, business, in life, or wherever, what is innovation? It has to have some meaning, some purpose. Probably it should provide some solution, some value creation. And for innovation to be effective, it has to be simple. It can't be a complicated kind of a scenario. Now, if you put all of this together, and you put, say, a company like Coca-Cola, we've had a very interesting history. It's about 130 years old company. For almost 100 years, it was just one Coca-Cola, the black cola drink, almost one SKU, 16 ounce, in a glass bottle. 100 years. You found a magic formula, you ran with it, you ran it for almost a century. And then came the disrupted world. And in the last about 25, 30 years, we have over 3,600 different brands, offerings, sub-brands, variants. Almost every day, there's some new beverage that is being produced somewhere in the world. And you're delighting over 2 billion consumers almost every day. Now, if that's the speed at which the consumers are asking you to provide you solution, then obviously the pace and innovation and the speed at which the innovation happens has to be very different. Now, when I said that communication could lead the business innovation, it's because communication is about a dialogue. It's not about what you're saying, but it's also about what you're hearing. And I think Jaideep and I were in a panel together where we were talking about brands. We said a good brand talks to the consumer, but iconic brands or big brands really listen to the consumer. True. So as a communicator, when you hear from the consumer, you can actually become the host which absorbs the first set of information, go to your business and tell them what's happening. In India, for last about 3-4 years, we were trying to, and there were a number of challenges that at least in my category, we faced. And we have a unique proposition where the name of the company is Coca-Cola, name of a brand is Coca-Cola. In many ways, soft drinks as a category is also defined as Coca-Cola or Coke. You go and ask for a Coke, right? You don't say that, give me a cola. So when you have the amalgamation of all the three, then you have to figure out what is helping what and what is creating a trouble for something. So if there's a category concern, it also kind of rubs off on your brand, on your company reputation, on your corporate reputation, and stuff like that. So that's where we try to figure out what happens for us as a beverage company. Because we are a total beverage company, we provide every single beverage solution that you can think of: tea, coffee, juices, water, dairy, you name it. We've created 21 brands which are over $1 billion revenue. Nobody talks about those 21 brands. We only talk about Coke, right? So we say it's time we take a step back and start talking about it. That's where a communication, a new narrative started to lead the business. So today, if you hear the CEO of Coca-Cola globally, or in India, or anywhere in the world, you will find that we all talk about the total beverage company, the solution that we provide as a beverage for life. And that's where I say that there is an opportunity for communication to in some way create and innovate a narrative that becomes the narrative and the strategy of your business.
So you see product innovation coming from listening to consumers, first of all, which is obviously something that communicators have to do. And secondly, of course, communicators being able to set a new narrative which leads that kind of innovative mindset. Paroma, I wanted to come to you next to get your views on this question, because you're someone who's worked in the technology sector for a reasonable amount of time, and I suspect that is the home of innovation. Do you think that communications can actually lead innovation when it comes to a business level?
Can you hear me? Yeah. I turn this argument on its head, as I often do. I think, communication does not exist as a pillar of functional excellence. Business is the most important stakeholder that you have. If there's innovation in the business, and innovation needs to follow in communications, because you have to partner the business, drive the business objective, and help business achieve them. I'm not saying that the communication cannot have objectives of its own, but the primary responsibility or the core narrative needs to be business success and business partnering. That's how I always think of communication. My two experiences I will talk about, since you raised technology, Google, where I have worked for 7 years. There, it was very, very different because you're basically showcasing tech. So you're talking about innovation all the time. And it actually makes things easier because the content is so innovative that you do not actually have to think of tools or platforms to disseminate that content. It's engaging enough. And I mean, if I may just get back to the previous speaker, not Ishtiaq, but the gentleman who was speaking before, I hugely disagree with the principle that digital is a separate strand of communication. It is not. Digital is a medium or a tool, which is you employ in internal or external or Marcom. It is not a separate standalone branch of communication. So obviously when you're talking about technology, you will use a plethora of tools, and that kind of content gives way to innovative tools like, we used to do video blogs, one of the first companies to do it, because we often thought the engineers are very poor in writing, but very good at talking sometimes. If I talk to an engineer and write a blog post and use his name, which we often did, of course, it is far less engaging than somebody talking about his own product or on innovation. So tools exist to embellish the content. The tool itself is not innovation. It's what you do with it that counts. And technologically or technically innovative content always helps. And now I work for a deal company. SoftBank is one of the biggest deal companies in the world. And we have a fair amount of innovation there too, but it's different. We're talking to 4 stock exchanges and 4 sets of lawyers. Japan, US, UK, sometimes India. It's extremely complicated because, there's competition laws, there's innovation laws, there's copyright laws, and quite often a press announcement needs to hit the Tokyo Stock Exchange before it can go to press. So how do you actually manage this exceedingly complicated process of dissemination of the content and making sure that it's understandable across a variety of audiences? You are reaching a valley journalist who can be far advanced on the curve of knowledge or information than a Japanese journalist who's very concerned about what is happening in his own country. And UK, where the brand is relatively less known. India, we jump all the time, so it's okay. You can figure that out. So you have to think of ways and means of creating and disseminating that content using a lot of innovation as to what you do in each country. That's a whole different kind of thinking. And you satisfy all the legal procedures and make the lawyers happy make the stock exchanges happy and yet reach your audience. So we use a variety of briefings, sending the release, doing, off the record. Most of our conversations, unfortunately, cannot be on record. So that's also innovation, because you are reaching audiences in a variety of ways, right? So essentially, tools and technology are there to serve you. As communicators, you have to be innovative about using them and creating content and disseminating it. And in doing that, I think the most important fact is that you have to help the business succeed. Only then you succeed.
Okay, thank you, Paroma. So we kind of have two ideas here. I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive, but I'm always keen to see disagreement on a panel, nevertheless. Jaydeep, I want to come over to you now to get your views on this question. Do you feel that communications can lead innovation at a business, and if so, how?
Thanks, Arun. I was reminded of what one of our earlier speakers said, the gentleman from First Partners, and we had that conversation during tea time. What I think he said is that communication can shape culture, and culture can then drive, and that then, of course, drives growth. So communication, culture, innovation, the spirit of innovation, and then that, of course, then drives business growth. So therefore, there's certainly a link. Whether you call it a lead or we call it an ignition or a spark, we don't know, but for sure that can happen, and that does happen. And that's our job as communications. Also going back to what Vishal said in the morning about, it's also for us to sense what kind of relationships or partnerships we can build or nurture in order to get that kind of a spark going. And very often that's the role that we play. It's not just about a newsletter or an email. It's also about bringing consortiums together, enabling things so that people can meet and network, and then that starts off something else. But I'm going to actually throw something back now at everyone in the hope of provoking another discussion, which is, if all of this happens and we are supposed to be the spark, who sparks us? And when I walked into the room this morning, my first question to a couple of you was, by the way, is there a WhatsApp group for communicators? Because I'm not part of it, and I've been a communicator forever, and I'm as guilty as anyone else.
Someone just said yes, by the way.
Okay,
So,
wonderful. Please.
We got to be at it.
Please send all of us, because none of us.
In fact, there are more than one group section.
Okay, great. So, yeah, you're not, right? So, I mean, and that leads to my observation that we ourselves are in an environment that's becoming more and more high pressure, with also probably a bit of a scarcity of resources. So basically diminishing headcount and many more things that we are doing, we are tending to become more insular. So when we ask a question, okay, you know what, is this the first time we are doing something? Can we learn from someone else? Typically, we tend to reach out only to our own people within the organization, or maybe even across the border within even my company. But we don't look at what is Coke doing, or what is SoftBank doing, and so on. And that I think is another thing that we need to bring up over here.
So the importance of that a more collaborative mindset, and I guess being exposed to what your peers are doing.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned, to begin with, communications as a driver of culture. And do you see that purely as an internal thing?
Not at all. I'm glad you asked that, because I think maybe the previous speaker was probably talking about it more from the context of internal comms, but we talk about culture, we also talk about beliefs and attitude and rituals and practices and habits. And that's where communication comes in, or marketing comes in. And I think the line is a bit hazy here, but we have a huge role to play in external comms, in shaping habits and attitudes and making changes out there that can eventually really drive business and create the growth impetus. And there are plenty of examples, that I can take. within Tetra Pak, of course, just as I'm sure all of us can. So let me give you a very simple example. We make packaging material. We also make machines to enable foods to be processed and packed. But I'm not going to be talking about packaging material from a foods point of view right now. I'm going to be talking about something a little different. We also try and make sure that our cartons are recycled. They're paper-based, and you can recycle them into products. So our recycler one day said to me, do you know that if you recycle your cartons and you put them as a roofing sheet, cows can give more milk? So that was the insight that then led us in communications to create a campaign that showed how having a roof sheet made out of our paper cartons could actually lead to increased productivity, which in turn helped the dairies that we work with anyway. So we showed how this could actually lead to an improved productivity, and this became then a new segment for a recycler. So that's an example of communications driving growth.
Yeah, a very good one too. Thank you. Now, Ajay, you mentioned you're doing a doctorate that looks at innovation in communications. Okay. So without getting too academic, perhaps you can tell us briefly what innovation in communications actually looks like.
Yeah, sure. Thanks to my friend Amandeep, who's sitting here. He's gotten to encourage me to go for a doctorate degree, which I'm kind of grappling with. But yes, I've been thinking on this subject and working on this for some time. So what I can share with you is some of the learnings I've got from what I've heard from colleagues like yours and what we studied. So jumping right into the subject, see, we have the organization in innovation on one hand, and we're talking of communication innovation on the other end. We're trying to see what's the correlation, how does one really impact the other. And as Ishtiaq just said, innovation is about doing something new, which adds more value or incremental value to your target audience at a reasonable ROI or simplicity. So if that's the objective, that's what innovation is all about, and we have to see what communication does in that whole scenario. And then thanks to my friend, he talked of culture. So what companies are trying to do globally, when we go and talk to various companies at various cultures and levels of their existence, they're trying to create a culture of innovation where every employee thereby does what Ishtiaq just said, try and get more products and services which are more value additive to the target audience. So you build a culture of innovation, right? So this culture could be built by a threat of existence or by the whole momentum of the culture of the company itself. So that's what is happening at the organization level, what innovation means. So, and the culture is the crossover for communication to step in and see how does communication hold, create and sustain that culture. Now, as many of you would know, culture is sustained by a story, a symbol, and ceremony. I mean, some of the tenets of sustaining, creating a culture. If you look around yourself, the big religions of the world or any culture of the organizations are sustained, they all have a story behind the company. You were just telling us about Coke, existed for 100 years. Every city, every community, every religion has a story behind it. That's where communication comes in. Every culture also rests on some ceremonies, symbolism, and rituals, right? That's where communication comes in. So that's where the crossover is very eminently and strongly established between communication of an organization and what innovation is all about. So now this brings us to the point, okay, if we understand that we are very active players in creating an innovative culture by developing a story, by creating those rituals and symbolism, what is the story do we tell? And that's where certainly you find studying face-to-face with innovation and creativity as an ask on you. So what is my innovative story? What is my innovative approach, right? So, and I've worked on some model around it, which I think every communicator in this room would relate to, which begins by, and this is something we were discussing, politicians do it very well. It begins with listening. I mean, you listen to some signals which are weak right now because they are distant. They're not in your face right now. They're distant. And the leader is all about listening the weak, distant signals and doing something about it. So I call this model. We all love our job, do we?
Yeah.
We all love our job. So the model I call is love. L is for listening. O is for organizing those weak signals by putting some very innovative techniques. So now, at each of this listening, organizing, validating the contextual aspect of these analyses you've done, and then echoing what you've heard. So this model actually covers from listening to organizing, validating, and echoing. Now, there is an innovation potential in each of the categories, and I'll give you just one or two examples here. In listening category, we are fortunately sitting on a very, very innovative state of things, which is called conversational analysis. I don't know if as practitioners, how many of us are exposed to that level of where we are studying how conversations happen. And if you recall, in communication on the measurement side, we are moving from reach to engagement to advocacy as a model of measurement. Gone are the days of add value equivalent or other SOIs and SOVs, right? We're talking of reach, engagement, and advocacy, like you were saying. So engagement is conversation. So if you dissect conversation and listen to them, they are very nice, innovative techniques, and I can tell you more about it later as to what are those innovative techniques available for listening, for organizing, for validating, putting a contextual cover to what you've listened. And then how do you echo it? What you just said, Paroma, is how did you echo lot of the things you heard in very innovative manner? That's the campaign side of it. So I would just stop here and leave you with the thought that there is a very strong crossover building an organization culture of innovation by having a story, a ritual, and a symbol. And then for making innovation around these three elements, you have this model called love. So that's where I'll end and then maybe take questions.
Okay, very interesting. And everyone loves an acronym, so literally in this case. Shefali, I wanted to come to you because we've heard a lot already about how organizations can position themselves around innovation. And what you're seeing now is many companies, well, really every company, trying to tell their innovation story. But in the process, I feel that somehow that kind of devalues the whole idea of innovation because everyone now claims to be innovative. So as a communicator, how do you address that challenge when you're trying to use innovation as a means to distinguish yourself from your rivals? But the risk is that you're dealing with an audience that is jaded about this whole idea.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice, very good question. Can you all hear me? Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Maybe clear.
Yeah, I think we should have gone for the mic. Yeah. So I think, yes, there is already an overdose of innovation. Everybody is talking about it. And from where I come, it's a food company, even more challenging because for a consumer, a health drink is a health drink, an aerated beverage is an aerated. They don't care, what it contains, what is the nutrition value, how much protein. So it really starts by engaging and listening to your stakeholders. Yeah, and for us, I mean, at Danone, we do that very, very seriously. So if I was to tell you that in the R&D team, we have consultants who are just housewives and mothers, it might sound very strange, but that's what we actually do before we develop a product. We actually talk to 1,000 housewives and mothers. Because we really need to understand what are their pain points. And today, technology as a tool allows you to do that. And when you use technology for your storytelling, or for your innovation, it really gets you the right innovation in place. So, I mean, if I was to give you an example of some of the innovations that we have kind of tried to drive at Danone, we sell protein, a protein supplement called Protein. Now, for a consumer, there is really no difference between a Protein X or a Bonvita or a Horlicks, right? So how do you really stand out? And one of the key challenges we had was nobody really understands what protein does to you. So it really started with the whole prospect of education. So going out, we actually engaged with the Dabbawalas because there's already an ecosystem which exists. So if you can really tie up with the dabbawalas and reach out to your consumers, I mean, I think that's one way of connecting the dots. And we started a campaign called Something Missing, which actually made people think about the protein deficiency in their diet in a very innovative way. So for a week, we just sent out Protein X samples to these consumers and got them thinking. We launched a protein calculator, so you can actually go and measure your protein intake. So we've tried to do it differently. I do know that today there is a marked difference in the way people look at protein. We've had a lot of insights from our stakeholders. And also, if you look at some of the other examples, in the industry, if you look at Gillette, for example, if you look at the campaign that they had about assisted shaving, they were launching a blade called Trio, and at the end of the day, it's just a razor. But the whole campaign talks about the transformative potential that innovation can have through communication. And I think that's a brilliant example of communication being leveraged to talk about an innovation. It's a tool, it's a blade which is used for people who can't shave by themselves, so it's for caregivers, and the communication is emotional, it touches you, it's relevant, and that's what we need to do as communicators, to try and find the relevance and to communicate it to our stakeholders.
Yeah, very good point.
And another element which is very, very critical, I think, in this whole piece of innovation, communication, I don't know what leads and what follows, but it's all about using the technology, and shareability and virality of the whole thing plays a very, very critical role today. So we have to keep that in mind.
Arun, can I add a point on the challenge?
Of course, sure.
This is just about an example I wanted to give, which some people might relate to. One of the easier ways, not necessarily easier in terms of task, but strategy, is to build an innovation champion, externally as well as internally. I will give two examples, both relatable probably. Some of you, or probably all of you, remember Nikesh Arora, who used to be the Chief Business Officer of Google and then moved to SoftBank and now moved on from SoftBank. When we first started, when Nikesh got the global job and he wanted to build a global profile, or actually Google wanted to build a global profile for him, very interestingly, because truly he was the first international face of Google in the leadership team. Rest of it was pretty much an all-American board. And Nikesh is an Indian who came from UK, or EMEA. So one of the reasons that we did so much for him, and he was from India, he was easier to build in India relatively. He's a good-looking man who speaks well, made my job easier. But that was not the reason why we built his profile so aggressively. It was the strategy of having a global Indian face for Google who would be the champion for internationalization of Google.
Right.
That is how we actually built that narrative that Google is no more this whole North American, Californian company. So that was why he was so visible. The second example is actually Rajan in Google, who's even now one of the best CEOs I have worked with, who still continues to be a friend and mentor. Rajan came from Microsoft with a very, very different background of doing B2B. And we needed to build him as somebody who will champion innovation and build internet for India. So the platform we chose for him is that Rajan is the face of internet in India. So, and if you look at it, we got sales directors to do the numbers and industry and all that jazz. Rajan would only be the face of internet. And till date, he holds that platform. And I must give one example for SoftBank. I still work for them. Look at Masa. He doesn't need to be built. I mean, Masa is a maverick. He's one of the most interesting people I have seen and worked with. I mean, he is innovation personified. You don't need to do much for him. But whenever we build a narrative for Masa, before any visit, we just focus on the kind of interesting companies that SoftBank is supporting. Because Masa champions innovation. SoftBank champions innovation. So the purpose of doing this is that if you find a face who's credible, authentic, and charismatic, fortunately I gave 3 examples who are all charismatic, it can be a fantastic tool for your company.
Yeah, very, very good point. We'll break for questions in just 5 minutes, if you don't mind. I just wanted to ask one more question, just actually related to this point. And I'd ask you all to be reasonably concise in your responses so that there is enough time for the Q&A. It seems to me that there's a little bit of a tension in some of the work and some of the examples we've seen around creating a narrative that focuses on innovation versus these kinds of stunts that are viral and that use a lot of tech tools, but maybe don't have the business impact that a longer lasting narrative will have. And I just wondered how you can ensure as communicators that you're prioritizing these kind of longer term narratives around innovation without necessarily being dazzled by the kinds of stunts maybe that perhaps win awards but maybe don't drive the business objectives forward. So Ishtiaq, if I could start with you on that one.
Let me start with a very interesting quote. In early days of my communications career, I had a boss who would often quote George Bernard Shaw, saying that the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place, which I think is the most profound quote that I have ever heard about communication. Now, we communicate, we celebrate, we think that it has taken place because of the stunts and other things that we get. But at the end of the day, communication is about what sticks with credibility with the audience, right? And credibility does not get built in a very short span of time. And a very short anecdote I must tell you, which I think was the biggest insight that I have had in the recent time. Last year, early 2017, we faced a very interesting challenge in Tamil Nadu as a state where there was a problem with an old tradition of bullfighting called Jallikattu. One NGO went and made a petition in the Supreme Court against that. For some reason, because that NGO happened to be an American NGO, Coke and our competition PepsiCo were somewhere dragged into that entire controversy. We had nothing to do with it. Then it went to an extent where there was protest against us, and then finally the distributor network started to boycott us, saying that we will not sell their product. And trust me, our business went like this in that state. Massive conversations, debate within the organization. What do we do next? Should we go for an ATL? Should we go and give big ads? Should we do, social media campaigns, stuff like that? And you know what we did at the end? We got hold of our thousands and thousands of the frontline salespeople, trained them with the communication, gave them a very clear narrative, and sent them out in the market. And those are the folks who interact with those shopkeepers and traders day in and day out. They had personal credibility. Each of those 1,000 guys had a personal credibility. They made money for those shopkeepers. Mm-hmm. And trust me, in 2 months' time, the negative campaign was over. We're back in the business, probably in a better shape. Mm-hmm. It's just that, so those are the kind of innovations. And so at the end of the day, I cannot probably go and celebrate this in any forum because that's not a communication which really gets recognized. Mm-hmm. It did the job for me.
Yeah, sure. Jaideep, your thoughts?
We live in an age of short-term memory, limited attention span, instant grat. People remember the tune but not the lyrics. 30 years ago, it was the music, the words that mattered. That's basically how it is today. And of course, the temptation and the tendency is today to go in for quick wins. Mm-hmm. It's also because you're working month on month, quarter on quarter, year on year. You're expected to deliver results. We are no different as comms. We have to support the business. That's the way it is. But I think the first question I would ask is, in order to not to yield to the temptation every time, is to sit down with your other, the rest of your management team or your team and say, what really matters? There are certain properties that you have to continue to build, and those are long term, and those have to be sustainable. So not everything is about running campaign to campaign. And I think that's where we also come in as communicators, in order to make sure that we give the right counsel and we build the right properties in the campaigns over time, because only those will then give returns. They may not be giving you, instant gratification, but but that's how I think that's the way to run. So it's also kind of a balance that we have to strike.
Yeah. Shefali?
Yeah, I think, like they just said, it's really about focusing on two elements, and one is relatability. So any communication, as long as it's relatable, it's credible, and it's, looking at the long term, I think it works. While we live in a world where we are surrounded by technology, so that's why I said shareability, viability, all of that is important, but that's really short term. So as communicators, I think we need to show the mirror to our, management leadership teams once in a while and say, this is good to do for now, but what about the long term? And that's where I think as communicators, we can really play a role, because let's not focus on the short term.
Okay. And Ajay, your final comment?
Yeah, sure. So the question is stunts and
Well, stunts versus
yeah.
real innovation.
So I think both are important. They do have a relevance, like we just heard examples of some brilliant ways it has been done. So if stunt is a first aid, the overall is perhaps the healing potential of how you heal fundamentally. We all have heard the terminology called SMAC, Social, Mobile, Analytic, and Cloud. A few years ago, that was all about digitalization, it was. So if you were on social and you were on mobile phones, your company was considered digital. That was a stunt. And you realize that unless you do enterprise-wide digitalization, if your entire enterprise is digitalized and talking to each other, SMAC is just the front layer. So I give that example because a lot of us got caught in the SMAC acronym and said that's what it is all about. So I think what we are getting caught is that we take stunts as the only and be with all solution, which is a trap. And I also think we get caught into the campaign side of communication. If we raise hands in the room, a lot of us will have examples of only the campaign side. We have very few examples and case studies of what LOV was, listening, observing, connecting the dots, trends. Unfortunately, we are challenged as communicators and validating in the contextual part. So I think that's where at least I feel we are quite underprepared, and we are just zoning in on the stunts or the echoing part, the campaign, and that's what ad agencies are doing today.
Yeah.
They're just doing the campaign part. So stunts are important, definitely, no doubt, but we need to go much beyond that.
So just focusing on the execution, really. But I presume that's because often that's what people are measured on, more often than not.
Yeah.
We have at least time for a couple of questions. So I think this gentleman here was first, and then I'll come to you after Nitin.
Question for Roma. You talked about the three leaders, all charismatic. What if you have a leader who's not in the same league, and you have challenges of driving innovation, but it's not in their DNA, or driving things which is really you don't really connect with.
That's why they have you.
Masa is not very charismatic in the traditional sense. His English is halting, etc., etc. He's a short Japanese man, 60 years old almost. But I understand what you're saying. Yeah, your task is easier with a charismatic CEO. But if you don't have a charismatic CEO, I would really focus on the content. Good content wins every time, regardless of who's delivering or the platform. Look at Guardian and NYT in a completely unrelated experience. You read them because they deliver good content. So I would really focus on the content, and taking from the last example, very important that those messages have clarity and consistency. Like a prayer. If you want to build somebody who's not naturally charismatic or naturally unwilling is a different thing. Unwilling is a greater challenge to convert. But if somebody is not charismatic, just make sure the content is really engaging and worthwhile, and it's delivered with clarity and consistency over time. What do they call repetition? Is prayer or choir or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty low bar as well, seeing some of the CEOs, on stage at tech shows. I think, there are great examples of people that have been turned into charismatic leaders.
Can I just add? I disagree with this notion of a leader cannot be charismatic. There is some charisma that he or she will have. You've got to figure that out and play that out. I have a CEO today who doesn't wear any of these things. He's a half-sleeve guy. He's an operation guy. He did all his life. He's one of the finest operator and business mind that you could think in the country. But he doesn't come across as a suave, typical Coca-Cola CEO. But he's such a delight to work with. There's so much inside him. It'd probably take me lifetime to bring that conversation and narrative out to the people. So I think
yeah, our job lies. Yeah,
and that's where the real value of our job is. You figure that out. Sunita is sitting here. She and I worked for Cargill together. We had a Dutch regional APAC lead. If you brief him and tell him this is what you should not speak, that's the first sentence he'll speak. So and trust me, it was such a delight to work with him. And I was doing a press con with him in the Philippines, and he was like all over the place. But you know, that's what you do, because and I would introduce him as he's an engineer. He doesn't believe in the flowery communication, but he is Bram and he'll speak like this, and then he'll just take off. It's okay.
Oversharing is not good. I remember a Coke CEO, I'm not going to name him as a journalist. The first thing he told me that he has 11 ACs in his room, in his house, and a wave-making machine in the pool. Okay, so, it had nothing to do with what we were talking about. I mean, I used both in the copy, and well, he didn't last more than a year. So
I'm not surprised.
Nitin, your question, please.
Hi. Firstly, thank you for an engaging discussion. I love the acronyms, by the way. The diversity in acronyms, love and smack. So this is an observation, and I'm happy for a comment if you would like to. So this is something which Paroma said earlier, which was that you have to have innovation in business for communication to be innovative. So just an observation that is probably not true, because innovation in communication can actually lead to innovation in business as well. For a company who may not be innovative or perceived to be innovative, and I'm talking from an example of, say, a preventive healthcare company who basically does preventive healthcare, I mean, there really can't be much innovation there apart from tying up with hospitals. But they did a great innovative campaign with something what Shefali mentioned on with Dabbawalas. And that actually led to being more innovative in their sales and marketing, because they saw what PR could do. So I think innovation comms can actually lead to innovation in business as well, in different parts of the business.
Absolutely.
Okay, and time for just one more. If it's quick, very quick.
Ishtaq, my question is to you. So basically, when we talk about all this fast-paced development in terms of business and objectives that are going around, there are two aspects to communications. One being the precision, the communication being rolled out at a very, very fast pace. Second being the storytelling aspect of it. And we as communicators are expected to make sure that the communication is precise, plus there is also a story that holds it together. So I would really like to know that how to balance it out and what should be the priority in terms of rolling it out.
Tell the story briefly.
Fantastic. On message
As
as
simple
well.
as that. Again, 30 seconds. I was with the most important stakeholder of the country, the Prime Minister's office, and I had the global CEO coming, and we were working on a meeting. And his principal secretary, because I handle policy, government relations, and communications together, he asked me in one sentence, give me the reason why the Prime Minister should meet your CEO. I said, because we are the agri-processing company. I said, you're Coca-Cola. I said, look at our business. You'll figure out. Everything we do is a process of an agriculture produce. That's it. He said, there's no reason why the Prime Minister should not meet your CEO. One line story.
Brilliant.
That was quite precise.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our great panel today, Paroma, Jaydeep, Ishtaq, Ajay, and Shefali. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Arvind.
Thank you.
And thank you.
A little picture.